Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today we're continuing the plot to seize the White House by Jules Archer. This is chapter 10 of part 2. Lejeune finally succeeded in getting him detached from Haitian service, but to Butler's dismay, instead of being sent overseas, he was ordered to take over a swampy new Marine base at Quantico, Virginia, on the Potomac, 30 miles south of Washington. Here he had to train regiments of raw boots for the front and glumly watch them pull out for France without him. He felt irked with his father for failing to use his influence to get him into combat. Thomas Butler had visited the front and had been greatly disturbed by the high casualties of American troops. Smedley wondered whether his father had refused to help him get overseas out of a dread of losing him in the European carnage. He persisted in nagging Marine headquarters for an overseas command, but his refusal to be discreet even now antagonized his superior officers. Learning that a move was afoot to raise the rank of the Marine, the commandant to Lieutenant General, he spoke out against it as a rank piece of opportunism. No similar promotions were being suggested, he pointed out acidly, for the leathernecks in the trenches of France. His friends in the Corps moaned at this bull-in-a-china-shop gaffe, warning him that his indiscreet candor was hurting his career. He remained stubbornly convinced of his right to speak out vigorously against injustice in the Corps. He finally found a way to get overseas when the 13th Marines came to Quantico for training. Josephus Daniels, Jr., son of the Secretary of the Navy, was with the regiment. Meeting his father, Butler persuaded Daniels Sr. that young Marines like his son needed the protection overseas of veteran Marine commanders like Smedley Butler. Despite the opposition of the desk admirals in Washington, Butler was finally ordered overseas with the regiment. Bidding farewell to his family, Butler was happy in the conviction that he was headed for the front at last. For 20 years, he told his wife, he had been preparing for the big war that he dreaded, yet had anticipated. At last, he would be serving his country in its greatest hour of crisis. In his patriotic zeal, his qualms about the commercial intrigues he had learned to suspect behind troop movements were swept away. Anchoring at Brest on September 24, 1918, he and his men were assigned to a dreary armory debarkation center, Camp Pontonazan, consisting of 1,700 acres of mud flats occupied by 75,000 American soldiers, of whom 16,000 had the flu. Returning casualties had complained of scandalous conditions at Pontonazan, where they had been forced to wait in ships, home lying in mud, hungry, chilled, and medically neglected. Day after day, he waited impatiently for his orders to move up to the fighting zone. After 2 weeks, he was handed a telegram from the AEF commander, General John J. Pershing, informing the 37-year-old Butler that he had been promoted to the rank of brigadier general, making him the youngest Marine ever to achieve that rank, and he was finally assigned his new command, in charge of Camp Pontonazan. Butler read the telegram 3 times, unable to believe it. Then he let out a roar of fury. The bastards! The unutterable bastards! They couldn't do this to him. After 20 years of a fighting Marine, to be denied the opportunity to lead his men into battle and be forced to sit instead in a dirty mud hole a light year away from the fighting. To make matters worse, he discovered that one officer after another had been put in charge of the miserable concentration camp and pest trap that was now his responsibility, only to fail dismally in their attempts to clean it up. It was obvious to him that he had been handed a lemon of a command, ending his dreams of fighting in the Meuse-Argonne. Bitter, he added Pershing to his list of enemies in top echelons. Pershing, actually, had been motivated only by the desperate need for a good administrator who could do something about the mess at Pontonazan, the linchpin for troops and equipment coming into France, and for wounded and sick troops going home. Butler's record as an able administrator in Haiti and Quantico had marked him as the man for the job, so he was forced to watch glumly as the 13th Marines left for the front, leaving him behind in command of an all-army outfit in Brest. Shaking off his despond and self-pity, Butler went to work. Not long afterward, writer Mary Roberts Reinhardt arrived with orders from Secretary of War Newton Baker to investigate the terrible conditions at Pontonazen. Touring the camp, talking to the troops, she was astonished to find morale high. One private told her enthusiastically, "I'd cross hell on a slat if Butler gave the word." She wrote later, "In charge of the camp that was that dynamo of energy, courage, and sheer ability, General Smedley Butler of the Marines. And Butler was no red tape man. In defiance of regulations, he was issuing double rations of food and serving hot soup all day long to those who needed it. He had issued also 6 blankets to each man, and as the ground under the tents was nothing but mud, he had raided the wharf at Brest of duck boards no longer needed for the trenches, carried the first one himself up that 4-mile hill to the camp, and thus provided something in the way of protection for the men to sleep on. To have produced the morale I have found under existing conditions was nothing short of a miracle of ability, and I said so. Even the flu, taking its daily toll of men in the hospital nearby, was practically non-existent in the camp. I had never seen General Butler before, and I went prepared to send in a blistering report to Washington, but the men were in fine condition and cheerful." Her report to Baker was so glowing that the Secretary of War promised to send Butler everything he needed. Soon after the armistice, Butler threw the gears of camp operation into reverse. In a single day, 26,000 men were processed onto ships, 2,000 newcomers were processed into France, and 10,000 men fresh from the line were processed into camp. Every man back from the front was deloused, bathed, and freshly dressed and equipped within 24 hours. The camp was the outstanding marvel of American efficiency on French soil. During an inspection by Pershing, the commander of the AEF noticed that as Butler drove him around the camp, doughboy after doughboy failed to salute them. Irked, he snapped to Butler, "Don't you think they should be taught to salute?" "Well, General," Butler said with a shrug, "if the Army had them from 6 months to 6 years and they haven't learned to salute, you can't expect a Marine to teach them in 6 days. He was always on the side of the powerless against the brass. One day, while he was absent, his superior, General Helmick, made a surprise inspection of Pontonazen. Finding wastefulness in one mess, Helmick savagely tongue-lashed the lieutenant in charge. When Butler learned about it, he phoned the Army Chief of Staff. "If the General has any complaint with the camp," he stormed, "tell him to pick on me and not on a young lieutenant who is doing his level best." When Helmick came to see him, Butler pounded on the desk and told his superior what he thought of him for jumping on a boy. After Butler's angry outburst had subsided, Helmick replied, "Now, Smedley, I'll talk. I've let you abuse me, your commander, for 2 reasons. First, because you've been of such tremendous value to my organization, and second, because I know I didn't do the right thing by that boy. I also realize that you've worked yourself into a state of nervous collapse to make this camp a success. I know you don't mean what you're saying, and I never permit myself to be aroused by a tired man's utterances, when that tired man is a good man." "General, by God," Butler said hoarsely, struck with admiration, "you are some commander." Helmick then went with Butler to the young lieutenant and apologized to him publicly in front of all the cooks and KPs. torn between court-martialing him for frequent intransigence toward higher authority and decorating him for his accomplishments at an almost impossible job, the Army finally awarded him its Distinguished Service Medal. The Navy felt impelled to follow suit with its own Distinguished Service Medal. The French awarded him with their Order of the Black Star. He wore these decorations proudly beside his World War I Victory Medal with French clasp. But the reward he treasured most was the gratitude of hundreds of thousands of doughboys back from the misery of the trenches, grateful for his efforts to ease their hardships as they waited for evacuation home. He did a lot of thinking, hard thinking, as he watched the wounded and maimed pass through Pontonaison, some with their nervous systems irreparably shattered. Gradually it began to dawn on me to wonder, he related later, what on earth these American boys are doing getting wounded and killed and buried in France. This uneasy reflection began to plant seeds of doubt in his mind about the ethics of his chosen calling.